One time me and my friends were out hunting in a big forest in our home country of Australia, and I saw a huge monster. It had arms and legs like a human, but it defiantly was not a human. It was what I would consider the very most frightening moment of my life. I told my friends that I seen a monster, and they did not believe it until they heard it raw from the forest depths. Then we split up to look for it because we had guns and could easily fight it. Wait, Michael, this is the best you can do? In my hands I grasped a page of smudged and scribbled writing, barely legible and barely readable. I didn't need to read past the first 2 paragraphs to know it was garbage. This is 11th grade English, buddy. Your writing should be leagues better than this. I tried to continue the story, but decided not to over fear of losing all respect for the daft young man that stood in front of me. "Oh, come on, sir," he whined. "This is English studies. This is the class we elected, so we didn't have to put in any effort." He tried to weasel his way out of doing work like he always did. Every day. I was fucking sick of it. Come to think of it, I didn't have a whole lot of respect left for the little shit anyways. "Michael, I don't care if this is standard English, advanced English, extension English, or English studies. So long as I am your teacher, you will put in the correct amount of effort. Now take the story back to your desk, throw it out, and rewrite me something that isn't absent of character development and a decent plot." "I don't give a fuck, sir." "Excuse me, Michael, but that language is I'm only going to be a mechanic when I leave this piece of shit school anyway. In what world do I need to be able to write stories good anyway?" "Michael, please shut the hell up and sit down," I yelled. "Wow, sir. I thought you were almost going to tell me to shut the fuck up." Michael gleamed as the students around him chuckled. "Michael, that language is not, because we all know that my father would love to hear how I am getting verbally abused by my English teacher," he interrupted. "That would be quite the scene at the parent-teacher interviews tonight." The class went quiet. Michael's father was just as much of a loose cannon as his son, and had a well-earned reputation for violent outbursts at school events. I swallowed my pride and put on a fake smile just for the shit of a kid that stood in front of me. "I am sure your father and I will have a lovely conversation about your progress in class and your attitude towards learning. Now I will reinstate the fact that your story deserves a place in the bin more so than a moldy apple. So sit down, write a decent story, and be quiet for some time." Michael, obviously disappointed at the fact that he could not intimidate me, did exactly as I asked of him. "Remember our writing tools, Michael. Please be careful." I motioned to a massive poster, prominent on the wall beside the whiteboard. It was an acrostic poem I had created for the class. I was proud of it, but it seemed my class paid no attention to it. And that is a regular lesson in 11th grade English studies at Bowral High School. Granted, English studies was a non-ATAR subject, so there were no exams, and everyone who elected the subject was either planning to drop out, too lazy to do work, or generally stupid. I was supposed to be teaching advanced and extension English, but it was my first year working here and the staff weren't too keen on letting a newcomer take the reins. Either way, I had made it through 1 semester, and tonight was my first parent-teacher interview at the school. All the interviews went well, and I met a range of parents and personalities. Some parents took their children's learning more seriously than I do, and some parents were less enthusiastic about their children's learning than their children were. However, the last-minute booking was what made me stay later than most other teachers. Max McInnes, Michael's father. Whilst I hate to admit it, I was a little nervous. I had heard the stories, and his reputation preceded him. Eventually, I convinced myself all would be well, and that Max couldn't possibly be the monster that my fellow colleagues had described, even if he did try to fight the school principal last year. I was reviewing Michael's homework when his father entered. The man paced like a predator. Each step was methodical and meaningful. His clothes were well worn, but tattered to a degree that almost made them fashionable. His head consisted of thick dark hair that slicked back over his scalp and hung to his shoulders. His hair continued down onto his face in the form of a beard, which concealed all but the menacing eyes that fixated on me as if I was his prey. The chiseled nose that twitched ever so slightly, as if he had picked up on my scent of Jup aftershave and freshly dry cleaned clothes. With a big smile on his face, he extended his paw-like hand to shake mine and said, "Good day, Mr. Tyrell." The man spoke in such a kind and gentle voice it took me by surprise. I met his hand with mine and we shook them. I always tell my students to not judge a book by its cover. It seems as if I failed to follow my own advice. The man's personality was the exact opposite of what his physical appearance displayed. We spoke for a few minutes about his son's learning. He seemed oblivious to Michael's distaste in English and his disrespect towards me. Max seemed almost shocked and said his son would receive a nice scold. "I am sorry, buddy. His mom passed a few years ago and I am working constantly on my farm. I just don't see him that much. He was always a little shit, but I have left him to his own devices for too long. I don't know where his respect has gone, and I don't know where his motivation has gone. But I will find it, and I will bring it back to him." Max sighed to himself, as if he knew his attempts would only be in futility. "I know how it is, mate," I said. "Actually, I grew up on a farm myself. I love to go hunting, still have my old rifle locked away somewhere." Max's eyes seemed to lighten up. "What caliber is she?" "Oh, nothing big. I just have a 17 HMR. "Do you use it often?" he asked, his interest obviously piqued at the new topic of conversation. "Not since I moved here," I replied. "So much land out here to hunt on, but it's all privately owned. I don't know anyone who owns property though. You know me," he said smugly. "I'd be glad to take you out hunting with a few of my mates. Michael will be furious, but honestly, I couldn't give a shit. Damn, it'd probably help the little rascal pull his head in. Haha, I couldn't impose on you." "Bullshit. You aren't imposing. I go out hunting every weekend anyway. You'll get to meet a few of the lads from town, and we can blast a few bunnies and kangaroos. You can't pass it up." I sat there silently for a few seconds, pondering whether to take him up on his offer. I'm not usually the type to hang out with people I barely knew, but then again it was also a good opportunity to meet some new people. Ultimately, I decided it was a good idea. What was the worst that could happen? "What day is good for you?" "Tomorrow night. It's Saturday, so that really suits everyone, I suppose." "That's good," I said. "Whereabouts do you go hunting? Where do you want me to meet you?" "We have a little spot just outside of Belanglo State Forest," Max said. My heart sunk, and I felt a shudder of dread run up my spine, the kind that makes you queasy and send tingles through your face and hands. I had to readjust my position in the chair just to feel comfortable enough to continue the conversation. "Is that good with you?" Max asked, obviously seeing that I was a bit shaken. "No, it's fine," I said. "Just a bit of an ironic place to go hunting." "All that shit happened years ago, mate," Max barked. His voice raised a little and he was visibly frustrated. "Don't tell me you are scared of a fucking incarcerated serial killer." His voice raised a little more this time, borderlining on an aggressive shout.
"No, istutarat."
I was taken aback by his sudden change of tone. Maybe I deserved it, digging up old wounds that the town has obviously tried to bury and forget. That was immature of me. "I'm happy to come out." Max smiled, and he returned to his happy and bubbly self. "That's great, mate. Just meet us at the entrance to the forest by the big sign at about 6:30 tomorrow night." The thing is, Belanglo State Forest is the site of a number of grisly serial murders committed by Australia's most prolific serial killer, Ivan Milat. Ivan Milat was the inspiration for the frankly terrible film Wolf Creek. In real life, he was the killer of 7 backpackers between the years between 1989 and 1993. He would pick them up, kill them, and bury their mutilated corpses in Belanglo State Forest. It is even theorized that he hunted a number of his victims through the forest as if they were animals. In prison, he cut off his own little finger with a plastic knife with the intent of mailing it to the High Court. For some reason, there are specific people who admire this man. They believe he is admirable, iconic, relatable. Granted, he went on a hunger strike and lost roughly 25 kilograms in an attempt to gain access to a PlayStation for his cell. I guess I can admire his determination in that scenario, but that's a different story. Ivan Milat is in prison, but it's no doubt that his legacy still remains here. They can lock away the killer, but they can't protect the world from what he has already done. So yes, I felt a little uncomfortable with going to the place in which 7 or more people were murdered, even if it was just for a fun night out. Nevertheless, come Saturday evening, I cleaned my rifle, sighted it in, and took off to Belanglo State Forest. I pulled my car off the road, parking close to the tree line, out of sight. Soon after, Max turned up and followed suit, parking his car directly behind mine. "Let's go and kill something," he yelled excitedly from the window of his blue Ford F-250. The spotlights shone brightly into the darkness, showing the sign as clear as it would be during the day. It read, "Welcome to Belanglo State Forest." In a smaller additional sign underneath the official welcome, the words read, "Please be careful." The words seemed to burn their way into my eyelids, and each time the bright glare of Max's high beams flickered into my pupils, and I closed my eyes, I could still see the words, "Please be careful." Ironic. Suddenly, my car door opened and a thick hand yanked me from the car, dragging me out of my unbuckled seatbelt with incredible strength and slamming my back into the front quarter panel. It was Max. "Well, what are you waiting for, mate? The sunrise?" He laughed to himself. "Get your weapon out and we will make our way in to find some game." "Wait," I said. "Isn't hunting in the state forest illegal?" "Sure is," Max said gladly. "But worse things have happened in here. Let's go." I was a little uneasy about breaking the law, but Belanglo was a massive forest, and the chances of a ranger or the authorities finding us were slim to none. "Where are your mates?" I asked. "Not coming," Max said bluntly. "Why not?" I persisted, now feeling more uneasy than I originally was. "They came out last weekend." "Don't they come out every weekend?" "Not anymore." "Don't you find it a little strange?" "What I find strange is that I am out here to hunt and you want to play 20 fucking questions." He barked. "Hunting is about being quiet, so I'll kindly ask you to do so." I was unnerved by Max's hostility, but I tried not to think too much about it. My creative mind tends to wander, and I would just incessantly get myself worked up over it. Just because he was grumpy and a little bizarre did not mean he was a serial killer. We marched on for longer in the woods, probably for about a full kilometer. Not one living creature did we find. "It's nights like this," Max began. "The full moon usually means that finding anything will be rare. That's no good. But you'd think that the full moon wouldn't affect the conditions much in here, especially when the canopy blocks out most of the moonlight." Max grunted. "Maybe they sense there is a superior predator in the woods, and they want to steer clear of it." I laughed. "Maybe they're afraid of you, but I'm afraid I'm not much of a threat to anything out here." "Of that you can be sure of," he growled sadistically. "But I'll make a killer out of you yet." Again, Max's hostility and pure wrongness got me thinking again. Why has he become so aggressive? I didn't know why, but his attitude was sinister, and I knew there was something wrong. Bang! Max fired his gun into the woods. I couldn't see his intended target, but I knew he had hit something. Finally, Max left. "This is the moment we have been waiting for, mate. Come on." Mood swings again. Max had immediately switched back to his calm and collected self. The man I was hunting with was definitely not the person I thought he was. His actions were a little too strange for me to willingly continue this outing with him. "Tyrell," Max called. "We got ourselves a live one." I trudged quietly over to the corpse that sat at Max's feet. A kangaroo, the symbol of my country, dead at my feet in the decomposing leaf litter. Amidst the red mess, a pink organism was writhing. Slowly it crawled from the pouch and made itself visible on the cold ground. A baby kangaroo so young it was absent of fur. I held back tears as I saw it sniff and scratch at its dead mum, trying to gain the attention it would now never receive. Bang! Again Max pulled the trigger on his massive weapon, as dirt and meat flew up into the air. Fuck! I turned my head away at the sight. "Isn't that lovely?" He laughed. I heard the gun cock and fire again. Bang! Max repeated this action 3 more times.
Max sighed.
They chose the wrong night to be out here. Well, we better find another poor soul to mutilate. Max could go on by himself. I was giving up the hunt with this sadistic prick. I was going home.
Max,
I asked, trying to get his attention. He stared at me for a second and kept trudging onwards, without a word.
excuse me, Max.
I asked again, this time a little louder. No response.
Max,
I yelled. That caught his attention. He stopped in his tracks and stood motionless for a few seconds before he slowly turned around to face me. His face was blank of all expression, like a corpse. He breathed heavily, and the corners of his mouth moved ever so slightly upwards, forming a smile. The same fake smile he had shown me at the parent-teacher interviews. Then he spoke. If you keep up your bitching, I'll put my next bullet in you. What the fuck did you just say to me? I could feel my hands start to shake with fear and adrenaline, unsure of whether or not this was some kind of joke. You know what? I'm just going home. You are about as much of a cunt as your brat son. Not my fucking son.
Max left.
You fell for that one too easy. What? I asked, starting to get even more nervous. I thought you had it in you to come out here into the fucking bush and hunt like a man. I thought you and I could have been good mates. More than that, even. Max licked his lips as he looked me up and down. His crooked smile contorted in disgust, barely visible through his thick beard. Maybe I was wrong. You really are out of your fucking mind, I yelled. You know it gets really lonely out here? I thought you could have been more like me. Max started trudging towards me as he spoke. I planned everything tonight just for you, but you aren't the hunter I thought you were. You are the prey. I was now scared. There was something wrong. The temperature, the atmosphere, this creep ranting on about wanting to be together. I'm sorry if I look like a faggot to you, but if you want some dick tonight, you can go and fuck yourself. I promptly turned and walked away. Please be careful, the man said. I turned my head to get a glimpse of him. He stood in the exact same position in the shrub, unmoving, staring at me as I made my way out of sight. I made sure to put a bullet in the chamber as I made my way back the way I came. What the fuck? I whispered to myself as I made my way through the forest. I whispered it over and over again. I don't understand how I was fooled, how I didn't notice something was inhuman from the beginning. The way his personality was the exact opposite of what all the teachers described him as. The way he showed complete and utter disregard for his son, describing him as if he was a weight on his shoulders and nothing more. The way how father and son looked so impossibly different from one another. The late booking to the interviews, as if to maintain his ruse as the boy's father, knowing most. Teachers who could identify him would have left. His strength, as if there was no holding back. And his fucking personality, the skill to manipulate me so well into leading me out here. This guy wasn't Michael's father. He was a psychopath. Suddenly, the cracking of leaf litter could be heard ahead of me, followed by a loud puffing sound, similar to the panting of a dog. I aimed my gun into the brush, my flashlight illuminating what was only an empty space. Again, the crunch was heard behind me, and the breathing was louder, closer, and warmer. I could feel the warm, dog-like breath steaming down my neck. Please be careful, it said, in a husky voice. I turned to face my enemy before being thrown hard into the ground, dropping my weapon into the shrub. I was going to wait until we got further into the forest, but you got suspicious way too quickly. Max stood over me, pointing the barrel of his gun directly in my face, so close I could smell the gunpowder. Maybe that's my own fault. I used to be better at this. In one swift movement, I pushed the barrel away from my face and swung my foot into Max's groin. He fell to his knees, moaning in pain. For good measure, I stomped my foot firmly into his chin, knocking him to the ground. I ran. The man chased me, as if I was an animal hunting me throughout the forest, as if I was his prey. He had enough clearance to stop and shoot me if he wanted to. But he was toying with me, playing mind games like most serial killers do. I almost got the feeling he was leading me somewhere, trying to round me up into an area where he could live out his sick fantasy, execute his MO. Soon enough, my fears were confirmed as I crashed through the foliage and into a clearing. At that point, the pursuer stopped. The moonlight lit open the clearing to such a degree the flashlight from my hunter was rendered useless. The man stayed out of the moonlight, catching his breath, almost afraid to enter the clearing. The horror that sat adjacent to me stopped me in my tracks. Strewn around the clearing was a red, graphic mess of flesh and bone, dismembered limbs laying half-eaten and contorted into unnatural shapes, intestines splayed over the single tree that stood in the center of the clearing. A mangled torso consisting of merely a ribcage and skin sat upright against the trunk of the tree, with the head strangely intact and untouched. It was Michael. An immense pain jolted through my knee as a loud bang erupted from the gun behind me. My kneecap exploded from the front of my leg, and blood sprayed across the grass in front of me. The hollow point round came fresh from a 30.06, and the bottom half of my leg held on to my thigh by nothing but skin and tendons. I fell to the ground, screaming in pain. The strangest thing was, I couldn't hear my own screams, as if my ears were ringing so loudly from the incredible pain and shock that it drowned out all my surroundings. Just my severed leg and I sitting in a red mess. I turned my head slightly to confront my attacker as I lost control of my bladder. Max stepped into the opening and dropped to his knees in pain as soon as the moonlight hit him. A scream left his mouth, piercing my ears and becoming more distorted and inhuman the longer it dragged on for. His body seemed to twist and grow as the clothes tore from his body, leaving him naked. His body hair grew in a matter of seconds, covering all his skin as his jaw dislocated from his skull and rolled outwards to form an animalistic feature that could only be described as the snout of a dog. Canines sprouted from his gums and his eyes faded into a white abyss before exhibiting green, reptile-like irises. The hands snapped and stretched into massive, clawed features and the legs cracked and popped as the knees and ankles simultaneously bent in the wrong directions and adopted a canine-like DG trade stance. This was the only time in my life where the English language could not accurately describe the figure that I saw in front of me. As it made its way towards me, I only wished that I hadn't been so daft. If only I hadn't come out here. If only I had been more careful. I am a 27-year-old man, Dustin, and I've been living in northern Canada my whole life. With this, it means I have been hunting many times throughout my years. I've been hunting since I was able to walk. Sure, it gets repetitive, but there's something about it I've always enjoyed. It may be the thrill of finding an animal I've hunted myself, or just the thought of me being able to get out of the city and have some time to myself, but whatever it is, it keeps bringing me back to the sport. I have a girlfriend who I've been with for the past 5 years who's never really enjoyed the thought of me killing innocent animals, but she never held it against me as her father was a hunter himself. One thing she does dislike is when I go out on my own, as she fears for my safety as there are many bears around my land. Although she feels nervous about it, I always assure her I will be okay, and she does not need to worry about me. It was the same tonight as I got ready to start my drive to the country. My girlfriend had asked me to be safe and to go drop a gift off at my father's house for his birthday we had not been able to attend. This was not a problem for me as he had lived on the edge of town towards where I would be going. I had told my girlfriend I loved her and then made my way to drop the gift off. Once I'd made it to my dad's house, I had given him his gift and began to talk with him for a little bit. During our conversation, I had brought up that I was going hunting, which had instantly made my dad's expression change. As he looked at me, he said, "Do you remember the rule?" I replied with some anger, "Yes, I know to never whistle while hunting." My father apologized for telling me all the time and said he just wanted to keep me safe. I had asked him many times why I couldn't whistle, but he always said to listen to him and not ask questions, which made me stay quiet this time. He wished me luck, and I went on my way, beginning the drive through the countryside. As I was driving the way, my dad's face changed when I told him I would be hunting. Stuck in the back of my mind with an uneasy feeling. I thought nothing of it once I had arrived at the approach into my field. As I got out of the truck, I saw down the road in the ditch there had been a truck seemingly left abandoned. This was odd to me as there is no civilization close to here for someone to leave their truck. I brushed it off as someone just driving off the road while texting or not paying attention. As I made my way through my field, it felt unnaturally quiet. Usually a bird was chirping or the rustling of the trees blowing with the wind, but today there was nothing but complete silence. As I reached my hunting blind on the other side of the field, I had sat down and began to wait. While waiting, I decided to text my girlfriend that I had made it safe and that I had dropped off the gift. Looking down at my phone, I saw I had no service. Weird, I thought to myself. I had at least one bar here all the time, which was just enough to get a message through. As I was looking at my phone, I looked up and realized a deer was making its way towards my bait. I had gotten ready with my rifle as the deer approached. Once it had stopped moving, I took the chance to shoot and hit it perfectly, dropping it right where it had been standing. In celebration, I stood up and ran over to see my kill and put the tags on. After that was finished, I made my way back over to the truck. As I was walking, the darkness approached and the silence of my surroundings made me feel uneasy. I had decided to ignore my dad's silly rule and started whistling as I didn't have to worry about scaring anything away anymore. I continued humming until I hopped into the truck, driving back to where I had shot the animal. Once I reached the spot, I couldn't see it anywhere. This worried me as I thought the deer had not been dead and it had escaped. I was proved right when I saw a trail of blood leading into an unseen part of my field. As I drove around the trees into this little unseen part, my heart sank. In front of me was my deer, but wrapped around it was a large mouth with teeth so sharp they could bite the thing in half. I looked in horror as this thing, which had to have been at least 10 feet tall, ate my deer and then stared directly at my truck. This was my sign to get the fuck out of there, and with that I slammed my truck into drive and whipped it around to drive out of there. I didn't want to look back in fear of what I was going to see. Right before I made it to the end of my field, I felt my back tire get jerked, which I can only assume was sliced open by that thing's claws or teeth. This had sent my truck rolling onto the roof deep into the bush. This had ripped my leg open and I am bleeding very bad. I had then left and hid behind a tree. I am writing this as I hear screeching and bushes being pushed over, hoping I stay hidden long enough for someone else to come and scare it away. I don't know if this will even publish, but it's the only way I may survive. If you see this, please help, because if I don't bleed out soon, this thing will find me. I'm a hunter. I like to hunt wild boar specifically. Though I have been deer hunting and have been known to get a turkey for Thanksgiving, I mostly hunt boar. For those of you that don't know, boar are a big problem in the United States. A sow can have 2 litters a year, and it's not uncommon for a litter to consist of 10 or more pigs. Given that pigs eat anything and everything, it's not hard to see why the Department of Fish and Wildlife makes it legal to hunt them with almost no restrictions. In my state, it's illegal to hunt most large mammals with night or thermal vision scopes, with the exception of boar and coyote. I've been saving for a year, mostly fun money. It's hard to explain to your wife that a scope that costs literally twice as much as the rifle I was mounting it on was worth it. But I did it. I took it to a range and sighted it in. There was an area that was peppered with boar activity that I knew would be perfect for a night hunt. It was easily accessible with my truck, with easy-to-find spots that I could set up in that overlooked a large, easy-to-navigate clearing. The night started uneventful, mostly me tinkering with my new toy, cycling through the settings. I was a little impatient. I'd spotted multiple deer, but they were out of season, and like I mentioned earlier, my current setup wasn't legal for deer. I moved to another spot I'd seen days earlier that probably wasn't much better than my first, but it gave me something to do and a new angle to look around with my new scope. After an hour or so of glassing the area, it dawned on me. This spot doesn't have much animal activity at all. No rabbit or owls. The deer that I'd seen were hundreds of yards from where I was. Why was this pocket of land so dead at night but lively in the day? I'd set up around 10 p.m. and it was about 2 a.m. when I started to think about packing up, maybe setting up a target before I left and taking some practice shots. I heard a crunch come from the direction I came from before. I panned my scope over and saw the silhouette of a small bear pushing through the bushes. It's important to note that my scope isn't exactly night vision. It's a thermal scope, kind of like a black and white version of what you see in the Predator movies. I adjusted my range and zoomed in a little. I remember jolting a little when I saw that it wasn't really a bear. It was a man. Because he was so low and hunched over, I thought I was looking at a young bear. Is that a game warden? Couldn't be. I would have seen the headlights coming up the road from where I was perched. And where could he have walked from? I was 30 miles away from anything and on public lands. I was about to call out when I adjusted my sights and noticed he was naked. No shoes, pants or anything. I remember being disturbed by his movements like a squirrel or something, twitchy and grabbing at the foliage, sniffing around and palming the tree. Was that my tree? The one I'd been leaning against earlier? The thought terrified me. Could he smell me? Then he did something I still have nightmares about today. He squatted and placed his hands in the dirt between his feet and stared straight up like a dog mid-howl. And I heard it, a voice coming from that direction, a very compelling female voice. "Help! I'm lost!" There was a long pause, but neither of us moved a muscle. The center of my sights was trained at the dirt in front of his feet. I couldn't bring myself to aim directly at another person. It went against everything I'd been taught about firearms. Were they lost? Was this some guy that had gone crazy out here? Why was his voice so feminine? "Help! Please! I can't walk!" The voice called out. That's when I called bullshit. Not only could he walk, when I first saw him, he was traversing the land with ease for a naked person. So good I mistook him for a bear. That's a fucking trap. This guy is trying to lure me to him with a damsel in distress routine. Luckily, the lack of activity before had caused me to pack up most of my gear. I think I may have left behind a hat and a sitting pad, but I didn't give a shit in that moment. I took my eyes off him for a moment to get my pack on. I buckled my chest strap and scrambled for my rifle. To my horror, he was in the same position, but his face was staring in my direction, and I swear I saw a smile. The thermal scope has an effect that makes animals' eyes appear white. How the hell had he heard me get up and put my gear on? He must have easily been 150 yards away. "Fuck off!" I screamed in that direction. He stood upright, and it hit me how tall and skinny he was. Easily 6 feet and very lean. He took a couple of long strides in my direction, and I instinctively sent a round sailing above his head into the tree-line. He was freaky as hell, but he hadn't really threatened me. What would I tell the cops? I was unwilling and unready to shoot someone. He stopped dead in his tracks and hunched down on all fours. "The next one will fuck you up. Go away." He stayed on all fours, and this time I had my sights trained on the center of him. His eyes were just above the grass like a large cat or something. I was trying to stop my trembling and knew that my voice had cracked a little on that last warning. I was terrified. That standoff probably only lasted a minute or two, maybe less, but it felt like forever. In an instant, he bolted left towards the tree line opposite the road. So much for not being able to walk. I could barely keep him in my scope, he was moving so fast. He disappeared into the brush, and I sent another bullet sailing high in his direction. I racked another round and tried to pocket that mag and swap for a fresh one, but I dropped it and didn't bother looking for it. I wasn't far from my truck, and I wanted to get out of there. I could hear him in the distance, yelling in this weird sound that could have been a laugh or a cry. I scrambled up the trail and arrived at my truck breathless. I tossed my gear into the cab, but kept the rifle in the passenger seat and sped off. For the longest time, I told that story from the perspective of having spotted some deranged crackhead living off the land like some kind of caveman. I reported it to Fish and Game, but all they did was scold me for hunting at night alone. Never received an update. It wasn't until I told this story at a camping trip that my nephew told me about wendigos, rakes, and skinwalkers. My story scared the piss out of him because the spot we were camping was technically the same forest I'd seen the bastard, just 50 miles east of it. He was so spooked his mom, my cousin, had to take him home. She was really pissed. I've gone down the rabbit hole these scary stories. I'm not saying what I saw definitely was a wendigo or a skinwalker. I'm saying that if such a thing exists, I may have dodged quite the bullet that night. Or maybe it was just a tweaker being Donnie Thornberry in the middle of the night. Either way, thought I'd share. Here in central Michigan, almost everybody hunts. Whether it's deer, rabbit, squirrel, turkey, or quail. We all hunt, so it's pretty common while I'm hunting on state land to run into a few other hunters. Normally, it's just frustrating. You pick your spot, settle in, and sit quietly for an hour, only to have some jackass go wandering 20 yards from your tree stand right at prime time. This evening was one of those times when my hunt was interrupted. Only instead of getting angry at first I was concerned, followed quickly by being terrified out of my fucking mind. I got out to my stand around 4:30 p.m., got all settled and sat freezing my ass off for the next hour and a half just watching the snowstorm come down. It was starting to get dark pretty quickly when to my left I heard the sound every hunter loves hearing. Footsteps. My heart immediately started to pump faster as my adrenaline started to kick in. Very slowly I turned my head left so I wouldn't alert the animal coming in that I was awaiting 20 feet in the tree. Instead of seeing a deer walking up though, it was a man. Instantly my adrenaline turned to anger as yet again. My hunt was ruined. I stared him down hoping he would look up and notice me in the tree, then turn around and go back the way he came. That way there'd be a slight chance I could still see some deer. Once he got about 20 feet from my stand, I noticed something was off about him. His body was completely stiff, his arms glued to his side, and he stared straight forward with stone expression on his face. His legs, however, were taking these huge, high knee steps like he was sort of marching, exercising. "The fuck?" I whispered to myself. I was a little creeped out at his odd behavior, but not really scared yet. After a few seconds of watching him, I figured he was some liberal asshole intentionally ruining my hunt. I was just about to shout out to the weirdo and ask what the hell he was doing when a twig snapped a little ways off to my right. The guy froze and his head snapped in the direction where the noise came from. He stared for a few seconds, then, out of nowhere, he took off running impossibly fast to whatever had caused the twig to snap. I stared slack-jawed at how fast this fucker was running. I kid you not, he had to have been running well over 30 miles an hour, as he closed 60 or 70 yards in about 4 seconds. As he got to a tree, he scaled that tree faster than a fucking squirrel can. My heart was hammering so loud at this point, I actually feared he would hear it and come for me next. The sounds of an animal screeching as it was being torn about rang through the woods. Whatever it was, he caught it and was, what I'm guessing, eating it alive. After a couple seconds of screeching, the woods fell completely silent, other than my frantic breathing. I closed my eyes and took 3 deep, slow breaths to settle my nerves. When I opened my eyes back up, my heart took another leap as the guy was standing 20 feet away, looking down in the snow at something. My footprints in the snow. Oh God, please no, I thought to myself. I'm not ashamed to admit I was in tears at this point. I was so afraid. I slowly reached to my side and put my hand on my pistol I always carry with me for in case it came down to me shooting this guy. I watched in horror as he slowly followed my footsteps. He crept along until he stood directly under my tree. Then he slowly lifted his head up until he looked directly at me. We stared at each other for a couple seconds until he put his hand on the ladder leading to my stand, getting ready to climb up. I was completely paralyzed in fear as I watched him slowly pull himself up the first step. Then, by the grace of God, I heard a voice somewhere in the distance. The creepy guy heard it too, and he hopped back down onto the ground. "Jim, I got one," I heard the guy in the distance shout to someone, probably his buddy. The guy under my stand took off running as fast as before towards the other hunter's Vochi. I saw my only chance to get out of here, so I undid my harness in record time and practically jumped out of the tree and started running back to my truck. Thankfully, I wasn't too far in and soon saw it over the small hill. I looked back to see if he was chasing me, but I was in the clear. I got to my truck and threw my bow in and jumped in, starting it and pulling away as fast as I could. With snow, I wasn't able to drive as quickly as I wanted, but after an intense 10 minutes, I was back on the main road. I don't know what the hell that was, but I know one thing. I'm not hunting in Stateland ever again. You can tell when you're being watched. There's nothing to actually prove this, but everyone knows it's true. And as I crept my way through the woods, rifle in hand, I knew there was something else with me. I'd been out in the woods on weekend hunting trips for years, and this wasn't the first time I had felt this way. Usually it just meant I had been noticed by whatever critter I had set my sights on, though on one occasion my observer happened to be a rather irritable grizzly bear. This time, however, felt different. I stopped moving and peered around, trying to locate my unseen watcher. I scanned the trees carefully, wondering if perhaps I was just being paranoid. Everything was still quiet, but the feeling remained. The gaze didn't feel hostile, like the staring of a predator stalking prey. Instead it felt, well, I guess curious, I suppose, is how to best describe it. Like a child staring at you on the subway because you're dressed funny. After a few moments, I heard a soft noise somewhere in the distance, something not unlike the sounds of a set of wind chimes in the breeze, but not quite right. I turned to look, but saw nothing but a flutter of leaves. The sensation of being observed subsided, and I continued on my path, trying my best to shrug it off. At the time I figured it must have been a fellow hunter, maybe wearing camouflage. It explained why I didn't see them, and why the gaze didn't feel dangerous, but I couldn't quite put my finger on the sound I'd heard. For some reason that noise bothered me, and I didn't understand why. Eventually I reached the hunting blind I'd set up deep in the woods and settled in for a few hours of watchful relaxation. I'd brought a book with me so I wouldn't get too bored, though I needed to make sure I'd look up from time to time lest a whole herd of deer appear right under my nose. I sat there in silence for a while, maybe an hour or two. It was peaceful, that deep out in the forest, utterly tranquil. Part of why I went hunting was to get in touch with the sublimity of nature, to experience isolation from the busyness and squalor of urban life. It was pleasant to be alone, with only trees and birds for company. I was pondering this when suddenly I heard a twig snap. I put down my book quietly and looked out of my hunting blind, searching for the source of the sound. After a few moments of scanning the trees, I saw my target was a buck, with a magnificent rack of antlers. 10 points at least, and perfectly symmetrical. I'm not usually one for trophy hunting. I'm generally just in it for the meat and as an excuse to be outdoors, but even I was impressed. I figured at the very least they'd look good above my mantle. I raised my rifle and took aim through the scope, lining up the shot just right. I wasn't in any hurry. It hadn't seen me, so I had plenty of time to steady my breathing and place the buck's head squarely in my crosshairs. It would have been a clean kill, an instant, painless death. That's when I got that feeling again. I knew that I was being watched. I could tell it was the same observer from earlier. I guess you could say the vibes were similar, but the intentions were different. Before, whatever was watching me had simply been curious, but now it felt angry, like it was jealous. The buck noticed something was wrong too. Its ears pricked up, and it started to look around nervously. I knew that I had to take the shot right then, or else I wouldn't have another chance. It was about to bolt, but something held me back. I heard that faint sound of something almost like wind chimes from behind me, and I closed my eyes and set down my rifle. I didn't know what was about to happen, but I sure as hell knew I didn't want to see it. This decision may have saved my life. The chimes grew louder and closer, mixed in with the sound of rushing wind. Whatever it was, it moved as quickly as a freight train. I heard it move past me like the rush of waves against the beach, the pseudo-musical chiming reaching an almost unbearable volume. I heard the buck cry out for a split second, before its scream was silenced with one of the most bizarre noises I've ever heard. I can't even hope to describe it accurately. It was somewhere between a slab of gelatin being pushed into a paper shredder and a crystal chandelier crashing to the floor, but even that doesn't fully do the hellish cacophony justice. It was so loud it made my ears ring, and it was followed by such intense silence that I swear I thought I had gone deaf. The whole forest had gone silent, as if every living thing was too scared to make a sound. Eventually, after the silence had passed and the birds started chirping again, I opened my eyes. There was nothing there. No buck, no blood, no drag marks, nothing. It was as if it had never existed at all. It was going to get dark soon, so I quickly left the blind, hiking as quickly as possible back to camp, perhaps a tad faster than was strictly necessary. I kept listening intensely, horrified that I would hear the sound of something not quite like wind chimes coming towards me. Finally, I reached my tent. I was tempted to just pack up my gear and hightail it back to my truck, but by this point it was so dark that I feared I would get lost if I did so. Instead, I simply slipped into my tent and got inside, fully clothed, with my loaded rifle next to me. I didn't sleep at all that night. At some point around 2 or 3 a.m., I felt a presence outside my tent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and that feeling of being watched came back in full force. After a few minutes of this, I faintly detected that sound of the almost wind chimes, very quiet, from outside. I clutched my rifle with white knuckles, not wanting to go down without a fight. The chiming increased in intensity for a moment, followed by a loud, wet thump. Then, the not-quite wind chimes faded into the distance, and the paranoid sensation of being observed abruptly vanished. I still didn't leave my tent until the sun came out. I sat alone, terrified that the thing would come back, until the first rays of sunlight peeked through the fabric of the tent. I know it's childish, but I felt safer in daylight. As I unzipped the tent flap and stepped outside, I detected a strange odor, almost like ozone. As I hastily began packing my things to leave, I stepped in something which I quickly concluded must have been the source of the smell. It was a slimy pile of what looked like white and gray strings on the ground, along with a rounded object about the size of my fist, with a texture like undercooked noodles. I had no idea what I was looking at, until I noticed the 2 small orbs connected to the rounded object with white strands. It was the entirety of a deer's central nervous system, meticulously stripped of flesh and removed from the body. I nearly vomited on the spot when I understood what I was looking at. I've butchered deer before, but I'd never seen anything like this before or since. It would take a master surgeon to do something with that much precision. I knew immediately that whatever had killed that buck left this here. It was a gift, a sign of appreciation for me letting it take the kill, an attempt at sharing the bounty. I don't know if the thing that took the deer knew what parts of it we ate. I packed up my campsite as quickly as possible and practically ran back to my truck. I haven't been hunting since.